failte rótaigh mo haach. Go dagad tú de dheon héans go nimid tú slán, is go wagad tú de dhé a bhagna údar thugtú leat a honnas.
Well, carachtair bit eile sa litríocht ná hé. Có luas a cluistear an ainneoin tá sé agat. Agus tá sé intíocha láithre ó thaobh an uairscéal, na scanán, féaltaí, tá sé forleathan sa cultúr. Aber an ainneoin sin an tain rud amháil, tideal na thuairscéile agus tá sé agat. An íomha agus an bagart.
Is ceann na leabhar des na scéalta is mó cáil ar domhain, tá sé eistrein gach teanga agus tá sé fíorachtach ag gultúr na naoine mass culture agus chuma ag gultúr na litríochta ag gultúr fiú tá tuiscint fellsúnach air.
At its root, it really is an Irish novel and concerns itself with Ireland and what was happening to the Irish people at the time.
A mí na Baltaine 1897 fáil siú leor a London le scríbneoir Éireannach. Leor a dhéanam na milliún de cháipeanna agus a ddéirí ina leor ríomrate, litera agus cultúra. Céanna bhfuil mór an eolais ar an údar tá carachtair a chruchaise aitheanta leithre agus spreag se líon mór bréagthabhalacha sa litríocht, is scanan agus a cultúr na daoine. Bram Stoker is ainneoin den údar, sé an carachtair a chruchaise an cúnta Dracula. Go dé mar a tharla duine ar bheag an aithne scríbneoir páirt'aimsire as Átha Cliath, go dé mar a scríb sesin saorthíochar an uafis agus litirtha an dóin. Go dé spreag cruthú Dracula, carachtair atá aitheanta ag na milliún ach a bhfuil a fréamhacha go fáil faoi cuadach na rúndíomhara faoi thuairimíocht agus chráirhréagach. Agus cavéad de Dracula a hagan amach ní as an trasalmhain ach as chúlra Éireannach a údar Bram Stoker hain. Rugadh Bram Stoker mBaile Cliath a mí na nullag 1847 an tíriú duine as saothar a rugadh de hismóirí mánachma protestúnacha. Baistíú é ón áthair fós dat serviseach a gaiisleán mBaile Cliath bé, agus Charlotte a bhathair a slige ó ceart ban uailmhíonach a bhí ceart aganta agus tionchar ar a chlán eile. Bhí Stoker bhróte agus éana fáiste a scríú níos muile go raibh uaireantán nuair nach raibh a haghlach ag súil go dtiocfaidte slán as.
It is true that I had known weakness. In my babyhood, I understand, I used to be often at the point of death. Certainly until I was about 7 years old, I never knew what it was to stand upright.
One of the key links, I think, between Bram's mother and Dracula is the fact that as a young girl in her teens in Sligo, there was a terrible cholera epidemic, and she clearly told stories of this to the family, who were so impressed that in fact they got her to write it down, and her written account of the cholera epidemic still survives.
In the days of my youth, our world was shaken with the dread of the terrible plague, which was desolating all lands as it passed through them. It was the cholera.
It's a nightmarish scenario worthy of Dracula itself, whereby people, for example, were being buried alive. There are macabre details like very tall people having to have their legs broken to fit into coffins, coffin makers coming around the houses basically looking for bodies, and Stoker's mother pouring a jug of water on the head of one.
In many houses lay one, nay 2 or 3 dead. One house would be attacked and the next spared. There was no telling who would go next. And when one said goodbye to a friend, he said it as if forever.
He was a rather lonely child, on his own, left to his own devices, using his imagination, if you like, to fill up the time. And so I think his mother's stories of the cholera epidemic, I think, would have had a very deep effect on the young Bram because he was so lonely and so isolated in that time.
I was naturally thoughtful, and the leisure of a long illness gave opportunity for many thoughts which were fruitful according to their kind in later years.
Is go choiste na tríóide mBaile Cliath a thuí Stoker in 1863 agus bagarid gur ó clú agus cáil sa choiste agus sa chathair.
He threw himself into all aspects of college life with great gusto. He's one of the very few people to have been both auditor of the Historical Society as well as president of the Philosophical Society.
In ainneoin a luahannas, bhó an aichna bhí Stoker mar mór sport sa tír sna 1860. Balua a haki sé le rugby na héireann, agus bunadí ard level choiste na tríoide agus na stad sherivisha in mór sports.
He was an outstanding gymnast and athlete, and at a time when the Trinity races could attract audiences of 30,000 people, he clearly was a star, not just in Trinity, but in Dublin more generally.
Bhuine an éireamúil Stoker, tábhacha mar hampla mar reachtaire an gcumann díospóireachta I gcoláiste na tríóide, caithfidh sé go ndeacaidh sé bhaim go mór a chós scoláirí agus go raibh ardmheas acu air.
Lean Stoker a ahar isteach sa stad sherivis agus thóg a grád an Átha Cliath ach ba a rustrachas le caidean bocht leravasan an rami a thug obair a hariscint don Dublin Evening Mail, agus besin an chéad criticóir an éireann a thug leravasan an lad ar gion dá léthuirí. Ba a gaibh leis an Átha a dathú cuasa batha Stoker. Scríú Stoker lervas moltach da Henry Irving astor cuairte Britanach go máil in 1866. Nar a casú ar a chéile iad faoihearú, hui Irving a bhaim ar Stoker leithre, ba chardi iad an bheirt ar dús agus cólacithe go luan é.
Bram Stoker wanted to develop as a writer, and he felt that to develop in that way he had to go to London. Irving was a fairly shrewd psychologist, he knew this, so he encouraged Stoker in the idea of coming to London and where he could act as acting manager for Irving. And he sealed the deal, as it were, when he did a dramatic recital for Stoker of a horrific work called The Dream of Eugene Aram. And Stoker is completely bowled over at this. He's mesmerised because Eugene Aram was a party piece that Irving always performed when he wanted to make a great impression on people. And when he did it in a confined space, as with Stoker, it generally had the same effect. He mesmerised people, he knocked them out.
Go ddíireach solar imirse go London le posta glacu mar bhainisteoir Generalta Irving, fós Stoker Florence Balcom, a bhí ó gealta le Oscar Wilde, a bhí mar chara le Stoker in mBaile Cliath agus a gcoláiste na tríóide. Rugadh nóil éonmhac Stoker in 1869.
Wilde and Stoker knew each other. They had both relations through a woman, in a sense. Wilde was going out with Florence Balcom while he was a young man in Dublin, living in Dublin. But when he went off to make his fortunes in England, she seemed to think that Bram Stoker was a better prospect. So Florence transferred her affections to Bram.
Bhainistí Stoker Árchlan an Lyceum d'Irving, agus Jerry leis an Árchlan is rahol sa bhratan agus an éireann a dhéanúidí, a rin duine cáil d'Irving agus a thóg clú idirnáisiúnta air. Mar a bhí mBaile Cliath, Jerry Stoker hain amráte in London in a rol mar Thion Taca Irving, nar a bhéidir da éigemas go dtí buas Irving in 1925. Cé gur ú gearscéalta agus rint úrscéalta foilsithe go hana féin, ba le lindá a bheith na chonaí in London in 1897 a dulcí Stoker Dracula, an saothar a bheith cócheangailte go bra lena ainneoin.
Go banúsach is úrscéal grán í Dracula, úrscéal uafásach. Ra hiaglaat ará I gaint an léirniu gur sort chiller atá agés, fantóir. Sé tá agés go bhfuil sé uafásach agus gotach agus actrúil agus os ná dúrtha. Is díal é Dracula an olc ina crut déana osar cóir. Éonrach agus olc. Agus I gibhlant leis tá buan, firin, scafta atá tiomanta is an deall sin, an vampír sin a bhilú inniu agus go deo. Ina measc tá dliadóir, John Harker. Now, sin a héan hall go dtí an Transylváin le gédul sios le capéisi delí chuine an chuntar Dracula é sin, mar chenig Dracula teach I London. Tá Dr. Van Helsing agus sin well an léach is mó atá sa rud. Ach tá an bagart is mó bhirt ban, sé siúd Mina Murray, ise tá sí gealta le John Harker, agus Caradí Lucy Westenra, an is an beirt sin tá siad faoi bagart ag Dracula, agus an na hiireachta I dhéanaan an chunta Dracula iad beirt sin thrúlú sin príomh-action na thuairscéala. Tá sé soléir látha de Harker go bhfuil sé ag plé le carachtair díomhailí agus é ina chonaí le daoine agus mrá díomhailí fosta. Ach anois tá Harker gafa ag Dracula ina chaisleach. Ach éilíonn Harker faoi dhearú, agus háil go sásanna le Dracula, san bád de Demeter. Tá Mina agus Lucy siara I Whitby áta hagan Dracula I dír, agus an céad rud a dhéanann sé ná Lucy a rúlú agus vampír a dhéanú sé. Nis níl ré ag Van Helsing agus a bhíon a cúla nó stácar gur faoin na cuí agus I a héirú ón na neamharc. Suúin Dracula foill Mina fosta agus éilíonn sé go London, na nis tá an buin ar a thóir go London agus rin sé iireachta gréimáil ar a London ag éilíonn Dracula uatha agus téann sé siúr go dtí an Transylváin agus iad sin ar a thóir an fia I gceart ar a thóir. Go dtí go merann siad san air Van Helsing agus a bhíon ag Passburgo agus is an sin a chuirann siad críoch leis, deireadh leis agus críoch leis an vampíreacht. Agus tá Mina sábhailte ón vampírechas.
Leannaí mo díaltas ar fáin na giunta sibh, agus tá aimseir mo híomh.
D'arbair Stoker Dracula an chéadgáil síos mar úrscéal agus mar grama státe, agus creatar gur dúil leis gur bheith Irving a dhéanú príomhról Dracula in Airclan an Lyceum hain.
Bra Bram Stoker bhíosaige cé có táhachttas a bhí an úrscéal, agus bhreise go córdó sort a dhéanú ar an úrscéal fo chuine an státe. Bhí seansáin go nglaithe Sir Henry Irving an ról mór sin Dracula. Ach Hepper Stoker an acórú státe dhéanú. Rinn sé iireachtaach darla Sir Henry Irving bhí sé uafásach, agus dá réad mar léon tú inniuáin is soléir go bhfuil sé neamhdramatúil agus fadarach.
Ba bhór an mBaile ar a bhainisteoir agus charadílis, spagú Irving go méidir gur drama státe é. Nar a fáilsiú Dracula mar úrscéal I Maltaine 1897, bhí ra critical air níos mó na ra trátala, agus ní go dtí níos muile anon gur éirí le Dracula bheith na charachtair cáil a bhfuil muid ólach air sa leat ainneoin.
Tá difar anna mhór idir an cuairsias a rinne Bram Stoker ar Dracula an carachtair a chum sé ar a gédul síos agus na carachtair atá úsar góir inniu sna léirithe státe agus go háiris na scanáin.
Bhí sean den aird na hasú lastaí, go an bhartha, Dimuid den cromil ban of year. Éadach dú ó bhain go bathaí séir, gan éon dach eile éon rud a bhí uime. Bhí aghaidh chumasach cromagach ga bhála caswangacha a bhí córach beagnach as cionn na sróineige. Béal morsanta mí rocrach faoin chromal trom, agus stair ícla geala géirde a clíonú amachchun.
I níor bás Bram Stoker, thug a bhean Florence, thug sí cead den scríbnóir Hamilton Dean a chóirú stáite eile dhéanamh. Agus, daoine go mbeidh leis, scríb sé drama stáite faoin tideal Dracula, the vampire play. Agus, chuithí sé aige de London ó 1924 go 1927. Rinne ach chóirú stáite eile ag an dramaúir John Baldwin agus cha sé seall ar an stáite Broadway in 1927. Ach an rud ba hábhachtaí faoin léirú seo ná gur bé Bela Lugosi a ghlach part and príomh character Dracula don céadúir.
He's a character that constantly is eroded during the 20th century. He is not representative of the character in the novel. He very rarely actually is anything close to what Stoker envisioned in 1897. And any film adaptations or television, made-for-television films, any of those that have been made since 1931 have claimed that they were based on the novel, but have very rarely actually incorporated the themes and the features of the novel itself.
Is fear a bhhaid níos óige atá ag éist, agus é bra téagathe fear siadúil cólaí fiú, agus chuir siad an chunta ag cába nó clóca fiú, agus sé siúd na hiomháin is aitheanta atá gin de Dracula go fóill.
This is the beginning of Dracula as a global phenomenon. A lot of people therefore feel they know the book without having read it, but in actual fact they don't, because none of the adaptations of Dracula have actually been faithful to the book. So ultimately the only way to really know the book and to appreciate it is actually to read it.
Vampires have expanded their influence across the entire world. Vampires, if you want to look at it from the inception of Dracula in 1897, are preoccupied with English culture, British culture, and represent sort of the colonies and the European point of view on sophistication and class. But vampires have moved to America. They've moved where the power is, and the 20th century is the American century. Vampires have firmly taken root in the United States and in popular culture in general in America. Vampires are on MTV. They are everywhere we can imagine them to be in American culture, from newspapers to print media, all the way across to breakfast cereals. They are everywhere in American popular culture.
Fág they're doing in Kest. Cé hé an fear Dracula. An Dracula a chum Stoker héin don uorscéil ag deireadh a níú istéag an monster úfás a gráine sin. nó an Dracula a tháinig ina dhia a bhfad níos tarringtaí sna léirithe stáiteach na Scanna, agus é sin an íomhá atá ag inniu, an íomhá aitheanta go dtí an lá atá nua.
Mar leor den I leor is mó tionchar agus is mó éileh dar scríú a riú, tá tuairimíocht gan stádon faoi TG4 Bram Stoker an carachtair Dracula agus an tuairiscéil a chrothú agus é a lonú sa Trasalmhain. Dhéal an tuairimíocht seo de léirhíú nar a tháinig achar document ainneoin an cinn sna 1970. Document a thugan dúchlan an bhain tuiscinne faoi fréamh Dracula.
Well, we're very fortunate in having the notes that Bram used in writing Dracula. These are preserved now in the Rosenbach Library in Philadelphia. And they show us, first of all, how much research he did. It also shows us how long he worked on the book, which I would say was about 10 years, because the earliest entry in the Rosenbach notes is 1890, and clearly the project was developed to a certain extent at that point. It also shows us that Bram was jotting down ideas, some of which he followed up, some of which he dropped, some of which he changed.
Agus rud simú eile hagan am as na nótaí ná an plé rinne Bram Stoker a héin le titil na thuairiscéile. Thosaigh sé le na nnéamh mara. Bhí sin aige agus lean sé leis ar fatamil. Bhí sé plé le titil an charachtair fosta, chuir sé an chunta agus an chunta vampír. Agus ní raibh sé go dtí, well, churas a bheith deirú a héair go háirlann sé ar an ainm Dracula mar titil an príomh charachtair agus titil na thuairiscéile.
Léiríonn nótaí Stoker gur tháinig sé ar ainneoin Dracula I leabhar scríofa ag Tailliúr Britanach William Wilkinson in 1820, agus chópáil sé amach ein paragraf amháin a liag amach tréthe crualacha Vlad Tepes, aire úsal na Romáine sa 15, nó Vlad a Táiteoir mar a tugadh uaireanta.
Anis, tá barúlach an mhaoin sin go mhaoineann an tanam Dracula le Vlad Tepes nó Vlad the Impaler. Ach, tá sé ríhiléir ó na nótaí Rosenbach nach bhfuil nascar be. Is beag an nasca tá idir na hanamh sin agus an charachtair a cum Bram Stoker.
I think it shows us how limited the influence of the real-life Dracula, Vlad Tepes, actually was in the creation of the book. I would describe it more as kind of a flavouring in the stew rather than something dominant in its own right. I think Stoker was attracted by the name, and he was attracted by the character of Vlad Tepes, and he does adapt certain aspects of Vlad for use in his book.
Tá Dracula curtha ag Stoker an Trasalmhain an coige is fuide suas san Romáin. Bhí cardeagamann sin daoine as an áit, agus neorósacha faoin tradiisiún litríochta seo nó faoin scannaíocht maran, bhí cloisteach go faoi ach ba rud nua acu mar cho fadaigh sa bhain sé leasan. Vlad Tepes ba leith náisiúnta a bhí an, an duine bhó a has an aon na dorcach. An rud a riú, a rud a rinne an tudar, an taine me ghlacha agus cud gon stair, ach ní léon bhaint chorbe idir Dracula mar higmadéis na scanan, etc. agus an duine starhfuil a bhfuil measar san Rómáin. Ní léonach gur chud sé an tainem.
Is léir fástó na nótaí nach raibh an Transilváin ríthhachtach in aigne Bram Stoker is ag plé leis an thuairiscéil. Ar a gédul sios bhí sé lonú san ostar. An rud ba hábhachtaí do Stoker ná go bhfuir sé lonathe in áit a bhí a bhádúí áit a bhí iargúlta. So héile rá gur sort uairscéil orientalist Dracula, go bhfuil sé iartharach agus gur thóg Bram Stoker finscéil ó iarthar na Eorpach agus go nglach sé thuige leis agus chuir sé I London agus chuir sé daoine ó London in lech I Givland leis an príomh charachtair London. Rud a bheith ionta charingtúil de léthirí London a rud a bheith ionta trádála fosta.
Léiríonn na nótaí gur gríomhaigh Stoker de réir a thaithí héin agus a forbairt a flotta de Dracula. Agus ar saoire in Whitby I dúsgart Yorkshire, thóg naimse an tíorólaí a táitiúil, finscéalta agus canúintí isteach san uairscéil.
He went around the gravestones in the Whitby churchyard and took down names and inscriptions and so on, and he introduces these into Dracula. We also know that he always kept a diary, and some of the descriptions from his diary that appear in Dracula were just lifted straight from his notes. So it makes us aware of what a complex work it was, and all the various elements that go into it.
Mar a ché Vlad Tepes sprág ó díire Dracula nó fiú an Trasalmhain héin, an álaí go bhfuil a bhunas le fáil a chúlra Éireannach Stoker héin.
If we think about Stoker's Irishness, I think we see a man who was Irish. He spent almost half his life in Ireland before he went to London. He's not Anglo-Irish, and that, in fact, is a common misconception about him. For example, he never lost his Dublin accent, even though some biographers claim that he spoke with quote-unquote a proper English accent. And the other side of that particular coin, of course, is that people in Ireland are generally unaware of who Stoker was and the fact that he was Irish.
Nuair a bhíos héna freastal mar bhaicléin litir a goláiste na tríóide, goláiste Stoker féin, níor tugadh aitheantas dá leids dó mar scríbhneoir litirthe, bhain sé leis an déascar lua le Dell Comics agus mioctasolaíocht den tais sin ní haolóch aine staidir litir a dhéanamh ar an teacs. Ach ní bháin sin is dócha I measc na Éireannach an seo na gnáchaoine níor ghlacadar le Stoker mar scríbhneoir Éireannach. Níl sé sin ceart ná cóir.
Dracula, both as a book and as a figure, is actually emerging out of a notion which is very Irish and very Celtic. It is really an Irish novel because the descriptions in it are not of Romania. The small villages, the roadside shrines, if you like, the superstitious people. Those were from Stoker's own time.
Fáil siíoch Dracula in sna 1890 agus tá chúlra speisialta politiúilte bhí ar go. Is féidir a rá gur ceap daoine ordered sa bhreatain go raibh ar a dul in éis le brí, go raibh réon na himpireachta a dreidem chun deire. Is dóil am héin go raibh na scríbhneoirí sin ar nós seo agus Stoker a buint leas as iarthar na hórpa, mar bheafar do éireann, do hasanna, beidirnach ra sé de gáíochtach a gcónaí an rud a rá go díreach faoi hasanna nó faoi éireann agus bhuiineadar leas as na bólaí eile dá réir.
Dracula is an aristocrat, possibly a landlord. And in an Irish tradition, landlords are not particularly sympathetic figures. So that if you read Dracula as a kind of Irish landlord, it's quite easy to see it as an allegory of the Irish situation. On the other hand, Dracula is coming into England to undermine English rule. So he can be read as either an aristocrat or a peasant, a sort of a rebel or a repressive landlord. I think it's quite convincing, I have to say, to read him as a kind of a rebel figure, frightening the life out of the English colonials. So it's not too hard to see it as an Irish novel, I don't think.
Bram was perhaps more sympathetic, if you like, to Gladstone in terms of the Home Rule spectrum than he was to Parnell. But Stoker was friendly and had lifelong friends among the Home Rulers. Valentine Blake Dillon, for example, he was a boyhood friend and indeed a lifelong friend. John Dillon, another prominent member of the Home Rule Party. Stoker was engaged with these people all his life. Both he and his brother Thornley were very committed, very active in the Home Rule cause. And I think that's something important to bear in mind when we look at Bram.
So, in many respects, Dracula is a novel about the time. It is a tremendous novel which holds a mirror up, if you like, to the time in which Stoker was living and brings in the issues round about and puts many of these issues into the form of the vampire, because that's what people do when they're unsure about what's going on around them. They put it into what is called the monstrum, the monster, because the word monstrum simply means different. And what they do is they portray Dracula as a monster, which feeds in all their own fears, uncertainties, and prejudices of the time.
Is tréthe iad an agla, an neamh-chinteacht agus an chléinteacht atá cóchnaimithe le tradition leithleat literathe na hÉireann gríomhí Stoker de réir. Agus níos moille anón, bhí sé an bháil is aitheanta den grúpa a dtugtar anois an Gotach Éireannach air.
The Gothic can best be explained as fiction which begins in a realistic, normal, stable environment, which is suddenly interrupted or disrupted by apparently supernatural or really supernatural events or characters, by elements of the past coming back to haunt the present. With Dracula we have 19th century, up-to-date, rationalistic, common sense characters who find themselves confronted with an atavistic, backward element of the medieval Catholic past coming to try to destroy the present and the future.
Tá tradiisiún scríbhneoireacht Gotacha an láidir I tradiisiún litríocht na hÉireann, agus tionchar an Reforméisán so aice an. An cá idir an sean religún a bhí gafa leis an paganachas, agus an religún nua, aimimse an religún úr a bhí ag éirí críoch a chur leis na pisóga.
Interestingly, in the Irish period, it comes from 1641, and we can date it back to the publication of the first history of the Irish Rebellion of 1641, Sir John Temple's version. And in this version, he configures the Irish Catholic rebel as a kind of monster, a satanic monster in league with the devil, and this monster is attacking their Protestant neighbours to completely destroy the Protestant religion in Ireland.
Is toch gonarítar de gná go dosnéin tréfsin Anglo-Irish Gothic nó Protestant Gothic an héireann go dosnéin sé le Maturin, Charles Robert Maturin, minister protestantach bhí ann gur coníir im Átha Cliath. Agus bhí sé scríbhneoir profisiúnta mBaile bheith na minister. Agus de scríb sé leabhar óntach cáiliúil a bhí gur raibh annach tionchar an I rihinna isteag. Sé sin Melmoth the Wanderer, fóill siúché stolim 80 buinn sé le Faustian Bargain an leith Melmoth tá sé tréis an am a díal leis an díal beidir tréimh sé maithú hin agus sinna bunús an scéal.
Fuair mé ó nábhaid na nanamacha síniu bacha ar an bhéide frontar de grach ar an duine. Agus an cuacht le taistil tríd an spás gan bach gan mBaile, agus tomúas deach an nonsiún le cathú a chur ar ainneoin ar an uaras críocha glíad, go mallar tú siad aitlum. Níor wallar tú aon duine chinúhaint le Melmoth an fannaí, haistil mé an dón ar a lorg, is ní chailú aon duine ar waithe leis a dón sin na ail, ní chailú aon duine anam.
An figúr an sais carachtair tá I Melmoth féin, níiad fad arúdaí an bhar má tá leabhar nuair bhíon an leabhar léite go. An sais cóchta tá buint le Melmoth. Is tólim go leanann sin a raig chuig Dracula, cé gur mótífan eile úsáid an Stoker, mar sin féin tlí táchtach éigean tá Dracula bunathe Melmoth is tólim. Mar de hiig Stoker cadíocht sé dhéanamh ón méid a bhí déanta ag Maturin.
Ach is scríbhneoir déanach gotach Éireannach a d'ag tionchar fad chréimseach litríocht dhúnda agus Bram Stoker ág. Ba olsíthóir agus scríbhneoir Joseph Sheridan le fanú a bhí lonithe mBaile Cliath early a héal agus a chudibre obair Stoker sna 1860 agus na lua 1870. Bhí scéal amháin ach go háirithe ó tionchar sillir aige scríú Dracula.
Is toch an píosa scríbhneoireacht an scéal is mó cáil ag leifin ó go mórmhór anois ná Carmilla. Agus buinn sé le vampír lesbíoch agus tá sé annachóchtach mar scéal. Nós Melmoth leith Maturin tá Carmilla ina batha leis na céalta fada agus buinn si leis an ard aicme, aristocratic lady atá inte, ach she manifests mar déirfá mar bhean óg atá fíorálinn ach gur chalíní eile go bhfuil atóir.
Bhí si an seada, bhí a haidh chin, dug agus cumig go scéalach, asúla, mór agus doratha. Bhí dach ciarach an saothar a cod gruaga.
Ní chéann lefanóring, ní féidir darúda dhéanamh ná gur téama erotic lesbian atá ann, bud atá fearrta mú i lárna ar nó istólim 8 timppel an Amazon san éo istéib. Bíonn siad bíon bheit bhirt chalín le chéile sa tach nó sa sláán agus tá bíon chorá eatartha tá fearrta múil agus fear. Allegorical nó suggestive erotically mar a dtíorfa.
A chéad seach, ná creid gur cruúlach mé. Fualaíonn mo chrí alta le do chrísa. Cónaíam I do héal siúlaí agus dúí tú buas. Buas bin is deach Im a buas. Is lumpsa thu, bé tú agam. Is íon duine sin go deá.
The best Irish Gothic writer is Sheridan Le Fanu. He was very, very influential in the English Gothic writing world as well. And M.R. James considered him to be the best Gothic writer of the 19th century. He's not as well known as Stoker because Dracula has almost overshadowed everything else.
Faoin am ar scríobh Stoker Dracula in 1897, bhí an phríchatlaachas a bhí folasach I scríbneoireacht maturin agus le fanú a lagú. Ach conniú ábharthacht an trúr trína gúlra rinte creidimh agus sóisialta.
The notion of liminality is really important. Liminality being a sort of in-betweenness between two states. Vampires are neither living nor dead. They're in between. And one of the questions we need to ask is why is it that Irish Protestants were particularly attracted to the Gothic, which is an exploration of the state of in-betweenness or liminality? And some critics have argued that one of the reasons why Irish Protestants seem to dominate the Gothic field in Ireland is that Irish Protestants are liminal, that they're torn or between two states. They're not fully accepted as Irish by Irish Catholics. They're not accepted by Britain as belonging fully to Britain. So they're in between Ireland and England, they're in between Catholicism and English Protestantism, and they feel torn between these two states. So in between states may be attractive to groups of people who find themselves between two poles, like Irish Protestants.
Ní cíle magó anmh fa creidú aine, is cuma go dé go haisteach leis. Rinn mé mo díchail ma aigne chuinneal oscailte, agus ní héad grach rudaí an tíal a gúnaí. Ach na rudaí neamhchoitianta, na rudaí a chur duine an áras ceacu an ar chéal nó ar miradá.
Rinnean maturin agus le fanú tradition eile leithla litratha Éireannach na Stoker, sa dóis go naiman an trúr acu elementí os nadartha ón tradition Beilgeis is deachan a saothar. Sin rud a nascan an trúr scríbneoirí le chéile na teaghlach ionta Wild, agus Jane Wilde a go háirithe ban chéile William Wilde, Mahar Oscar. Ba neachí le Charles Maturin, agus ba chúirtear rialta le fanú ag a teach sna 1850 agus na 1860. Rint blianta ina dhé sin bhí Bram Stoker hain ina chúirtear rialta ag na cruinnithe sóisialta clúte a thucraíocht Wild a Gearnog Marion a mBaile Cliath.
I believe that Irish folklore did exercise quite a strong influence both on Stoker and specifically on Dracula. And one area where we have very clear proof of that, I think, is through the medium of Lady Wilde. In the late 1880s, she published 2 books of Irish folklore where you find many, many traits that you find in Dracula to do with the undead, to do with the drinking of blood, to do with vampiric creatures with glittering eyes and sharp teeth and so on. But a key point made by Lady Wilde is that there are strong parallels between this horrific folklore in Ireland and in Transylvania. And that, to my mind, is the key point where the idea of Transylvania came to Stoker.
Ein ceantas na creadúntaí a luan Stoker in san leabhar Dracula is féidir a bhacha saol a dhiiscint I mBaile de sna ó heh creadúntaí na daoine. Ní hamháin mé eall vampírí nó an marmh a hagan ar neisio ón uig nó an relic. Ach ó heh na marmh trí chéile, cuidas na nósanna a bhíonna go daoine, cuidas na cosantí más maiile, nó cuidas na rudaí na beag a dhéanaan daoine chun iad héana cosant ar an marmh. Agus is as son I leabhar Stoker chuma chéan tú beidir gár lóig nó chéan tú an cross céasta beidir á chur suas á hispáin suas leis an duine a hagan ar neisio bharmh chun é a cumád amach chuait. Agus chéan tú anna chuid is sin díreach is tócha sin iad díreach na rudaí a dútar na pisógártha I mBaile de sna
Duine de na thuairscéalaithe is aitheanta a scríomh faoin na creideamh seo by William Carleton. Conní Clan Wild an scríbnúir as tíoráin a scríomh Traits of the Irish Peasantry go Gina Was in 1869. Dal sí le fanú saothar Carleton agus baganna eile a raibh tionchar aige ar Bram Stoker ág. Tá cuacht chreascrach hypnóiseach ag brídeog na rilige Carleton as airigil I dúsceart muinethan, agus an cuacht céirne na feiceáil in Dracula.
Yn sa chanam, o'r rylig na dafsi y togw ar y rylig sio. Agus coppla sgil ag Carleton mor ial yn mBaile just sin. Sgil anspéisiúil, sgil foin van ail yn sio a borach a hacht ag yn rylig. Yn rwyd y fi gas yn sio, fa rwy'n mwylid aracht na rydw eisiau tarw. Agus hannig sé an ainear ail yn sio tar yn ger. Agus yn ei tomod cora I leia, hog si galt yn ystol. Gaveki si ríist yn sa nait hier na ag an mísa. Agus hog si pág iastá yn sin. Agus is spega híle fart hier na gur leis pág an wais. Mar nar a chus an bháil agus chus a smúitiú ar a méid a hárlaí. Chus an nácas agus for se bás. Agus an anad bha bualú leis an ainear álainn, ba an sa nua a bhí ar a chur ag an mísa.
By Patrick Weston Joyce a dul sin finscéile sinne da bhfuilón a léiríonn tréthe na vampíre. Arsaíthóir agus fear cóimseire le William Wilde an acadú rígan na hera na Beidh. Áhairteach a baineam do híiseach a bhair sa chuig gois a ro cónaí a riocht céanda cógra da Garabhaí a tá dúsceart na heran.
He was also a great tyrant and his people were terrified of him. But they hadn't the courage themselves to kill Áhairteach. So they hired another chieftain called Cachan to do that. He came and he slew Áhairteach, but the next day Áhairteach was back. And he demanded a bowl of blood from his subjects as a bloody tribute. Cachan went to either a druid or an early holy man. The holy man turned to Cachan and said, Áhairteach is not dead. He is merely suspended. His magic has kept him alive. You must kill him again. And you must slay him with a sword of yew wood. Cachan had to scatter thorns round the grave and place a great stone on the top of that. And this he did. And the place that he constructed his great stone is still there.
Mar chúlann seo tá sean cran drainan deirtar gur ui avertaí attention. An teagmhfuil tá go fáil ag daoine an seo sleacht havertaí chreidim is teagmhfuil bhunaach Éireannach é atá a dheocha an áit tuaithe ar bí. Na sean airmathe go háirithe na daoine a chonaíonn ar na fermathe sin. Deirfí siad go bhfuil an cran sin banaithe nó ná buin cran sin, nó beidir couple of glúnahan dúirtid sin, dúirt na seandaoine gur ait an tlua sí a bhí an na daoine beige an muitir na groch, gur bhain spiridalt éigean leis an ceantar nár hiag daoine agus nár cheart a daoine a bheith ag sugrú na pléiciacht thart leis nó gur ó tú a guling lech le rud éigean déad tú dáthar a hainteart nó dáthar a haintear do witir.
Tagan an focail féirí chuing beidir os na thársathóirí sa 1910 ar a bheithan ag a Stoker hain ortha. Agus mar hampala is siad a chur an béir le féirí sióg agus níl daríir a gail díreach idir an dácail. Go háirithe sa chás seo inis más má hatú rá gur duine a fuair bás agus atá sa saol eile an sióg is cinnte nach eistriúcháin róha an focail féirí sin. Tá cosúlachtaí áirithe cinnte idir an taobh son den seanachas in éiring a bhaine leis na sióga agus an sampla más mBaile, an sampla den bharmh a chuirtar a gás go saolaíocht túil agus go crothach in san scríóireacht ag Bram Stoker agus le héad.
Ní amháin go baineann sé le focailach, baineann sé le híomhána atá thar a bheith scanrúil, thar a bheith tábhachtach. Ach darlam hain gur éirigh an miotas choláidir, chótéagartha siad, gur ág sé Stoker féin in os le brí. Tá go leor lár daoine ar fóill na cruinne agus aithne anhacha ar Dracula nach dtuigeann gur Stoker a scrí. Tarnaíonn sin na gcónaí le miotas. Teann sé a bhad as cócht an údar hain agus ní ar bhealach tá sé sin fear faoi litríocht ar bith nuair a ail síon tú ní féidir leat grím a chuineáil ar níos mó, is féidir le duine ar bith rud ar bith Ellens dó héin a dhéanamh bhas. Ach tharla sé go Dracula ach go háirithe.
Nuair a fuair Henry Irving Boas an 1905, cailú an bhainte bhí ag Stoker le Harclan an Lyceum Cumaí, agus chaith sé an chodeile a ghéal mar scríbneoir agus iriseoir a scríú rinseoir scéalta agus cruúsa scéalta.
I think it's clear that Stoker has been pigeonholed as a writer of sensationalist fiction. The reality is he's much more complex than that. And I certainly found researching his life, there's a lot of material there which paints a very different picture from the caricature, frankly, that has come to us from various other sources. And I don't think you can separate out any one of these aspects. They all come together to create an interesting man and, frankly, a literary masterpiece.
Tá cócht agus tá sweep in I réimse a hiiscinne tuiscin Stoker atá fíorthachtach agus léon ga chéine Dracula stólim agus déach ga chéine léomh cé gur bheith an scéala agus níl sé réadúil ach nach escapism atá nach fantasy tá go bhaineann sé le ceistena daoine ceistena daoire.
Fuair Stoker Boas a London ar an ihu abran 1912, agus go leor de scéaltaí Boas a chiamhnú a ggóthaic a ról mar bhainisteoir Géalis Irving. Bhí sé dá habalta san amúd smaoinú go mó dearma deanta de Irving céad bliana in é sin, agus gur bí leagaid Stoker den chultar dónda agus den litríocht a bheith faoi chabaidil go fáil.
If we look at Bram Stoker's legacy, we can't escape the fact that the major fact of that legacy is Dracula. But there's also the man himself, the life he led, and the influence he had on his contemporaries, but also I think beyond that. And I think as interest in Stoker develops, as I'm sure it will, I think people will realise that that legacy is a lot richer, a lot more complex than has seemed to date.
I think Dracula is a flawed masterpiece. It has an extraordinary opening, extraordinarily dark, energetic, almost terrifying, the meeting between Jonathan Harker and Dracula in Castle Dracula. It then dissipates and loses its energies somewhere around the middle. But in the count, it has created a character whose sort of power to enthrall has drowned out all previous vampires and practically drowned out the entire Irish Gothic tradition as well.
Nói by the undead nó na neamh mharibh an tidal a bhí ag Stoker an úl scéal go puinte Éireannach rih fáilsiú den leabhar ach tá cócht ag na neamh mharibh sa cultúr seo mar a dúirt Yeats, the dead may not even know that they are dead. Agus sin an fág go gcuiníonn siad a labhairt.